Today, we're diving into a huge question. I mean, how did a continent that was once kind of seen as a relative backwater become the most dominant force on the entire planet? We're going to trace the centuries-long journey that took Europe from this fragmented land into an absolute global powerhouse. So, yeah, how did this happen? I mean, this was not inevitable. Not at all. For centuries, Europe was really just a patchwork of warring kingdoms, and honestly, it was often lagging technologically and economically behind other great civilizations. The story of its rise is this massive, complex puzzle with so many moving parts, and we're going to break it down piece by piece. And to really get a sense of just how big this change was, I want you to picture these two different Europes. First, you've got feudal Europe, a scattered landscape of farms and castles where your entire world was local and power was held by your nearest lord. Okay, now let's fast forward to the 19th century, a continent of roaring factories, railways stretching across entire countries, and vast global empires. The difference is absolutely staggering. So what on earth happened in between? To understand how Europe climbed the mountain, we have to start at the very bottom. So our first stop is exploring Europe's fragmented state. This is our baseline, the starting point for this whole incredible transformation. The one word you have to know to understand early medieval Europe is feudalism. Seriously, forget everything you know about powerful kings running a country from a capital city. Power was local. It was held by thousands of different lords in their own castles. They controlled the land, and in exchange for a little plot of it, knights and peasants pledged their loyalty and their military service directly to them, not some far-off kin. And this system, well, it had some major consequences. With power spread out so thin, there was just no way to organize big projects, like building a national navy or funding a war that lasted for decades. Europe was basically a continent of small, self-sufficient little economies, usually fighting with their next-door neighbors. On the world stage, it just wasn't a major player, not yet. But then, a spark was lit, a big one. So for our second section, let's talk about the commercial revolution. This was a period of huge economic change that started to slowly but surely crack the foundations of that old feudal order and really lay the groundwork for everything that came next. Now, this didn't happen overnight, not even close. It was a gradual process that took centuries. You had trade routes that had been quiet for ages just roaring back to life, connecting Italian city-states with the rich markets of the East. Cities started to grow, and with them, a powerful new class of people, merchants and bankers. For the very first time, serious wealth was being created completely outside the control of the old landowning aristocracy. There's this old German proverb that just nails the cultural shift that was happening. The city air makes one free. And it was true. Cities became these magnets for ambition. They were places of opportunity, of freedom, of new ideas. They attracted people who were desperate to escape the rigid, predictable life of the feudal countryside. Okay, so you've got this new economic energy, right? All this capital concentrated in the hands of merchants and bankers. Well, that money fueled a desire for exploration and expansion. And that brings us to our third section, how Europe's voyages of discovery led to the creation of vast colonial empires, the very engine of its future wealth. What this created was this incredibly powerful, self-feeding cycle of wealth and power. It started with money, that new wealth from trade and banking. It funded risky, and I mean risky, voyages of exploration. Those voyages led to conquering new lands, and let's be frank, the ruthless exploitation of their resources. Think of the immense silver mines in the Americas. The profits that poured back into Europe were then used to build bigger armies and navies, which in turn allowed for even more colonization. You see the cycle? The whole economic philosophy driving this was called mercantilism. The basic idea was that there's a limited amount of gold and silver in the world, and the goal for every nation was to get as much of that pie as possible. So, for example, Britain would force its American colonies to sell it cheap raw materials, like lumber. Then they'd manufacture that into furniture back in England and sell it back to the colonies for a huge profit, all while making it illegal for them to trade with, say, France or Spain. The entire system was designed to make the mother country rich. All this incredible wealth pouring in from the colonies had a massive impact back home. It fueled the rise of powerful monarchs who used their newfound riches to consolidate power and create something totally new, the modern nation-state. And that's what we're looking at in our fourth section, this critical political transformation. To really get how big a deal this was, you have to remember what armies were like back in the feudal days. They were temporary. They were assembled by a lord for one specific campaign, and then everybody went home. Soldiers were loyal to their local baron, not to a king or some abstract idea of a country. And let's be honest, you can't conquer the world with a part-time army. But the wealth from the colonies changed everything. For the first time, monarchs had the cash to create a standing army, a permanent, professional military that was paid by and loyal to the state, not to some local lord. This was an absolute game changer. It gave kings and queens the power to crush their rivals at home, unify their countries, and project their power on a global scale. And just like that, the modern state was born. You had power concentrated in the hands of a monarch who was supported by a professional bureaucracy that could actually collect taxes and enforce laws across the whole country. A single national legal system started to replace that confusing mess of local customs. This new centralized state was just a much more efficient and powerful machine for waging war and managing an empire. All right, so by the 18th century, Europe has the wealth, it has the political organization, and it has the military might. But there was one more piece of the puzzle, one thing that would give Europe an almost unbeatable advantage. And that brings us to our fifth and final section, the Industrial Revolution, the great multiplier that turned Europe into the undisputed dominant force on the planet. The pace of innovation during this period was just mind-blowing. In the span of just a few decades, you get this cascade of inventions, the spinning jenny, the power loom, the steam engine, the telegraph, that completely changed how people lived, how they worked, and how they communicated. It was a technological tidal wave that would change the world forever. Let's just look at one thing to get the insane scale of this change: iron production in Britain. In 1740, the whole country produced about 18,000 tons. Okay, just over a century later, that number had exploded to 2 million tons. This wasn't just growth, this was a fundamental reordering of what humanity was capable of producing. And the impact on wealth was just as dramatic. Between 1700 and 1900, the average income in Britain, the heart of the revolution, went up by about 10 times. This created a level of prosperity and economic power that was just utterly unprecedented in all of human history. So when you combine that industrial might with all the colonial wealth and the centralized state power, well, the result was an overwhelming advantage on the world stage. It was a recipe for global dominance. So let's trace that path just one last time. It all started with the commercial revolution. That was the foundation that broke the old feudal mold. Then came the age of colonialism, which acted as this massive engine, just funneling resources from all over the world into Europe. The nation-state provided the efficient political framework to manage all this new power. And finally, the Industrial Revolution was the great multiplier, giving Europe the decisive technological edge it needed to dominate the globe. So what can we take away from this incredible story? Well, maybe the most important lesson is that global power is never permanent. The same forces that fueled Europe's rise, economic innovation, technological change, political transformation, they're all still at work today, constantly shaping the world in ways we can't even fully imagine yet. It really makes you wonder, what will the next great global transformation look like?